Hello and welcome to the final session in our series this year on architecture and philosophy. This is actually a long-standing series that goes back to June of 2020, where the inaugural lecture in our doctoral consortium series was given by Slavoj Žižek, the great Slavoj Žižek. The purpose of these sessions is to try and find a global platform, a singular platform where we can bring together all the doctoral candidates and would-be doctoral candidates and young academics in the world to talk about the key thinkers and their relevance to architecture. We've been through some of the, let's say, the most famous names, Deleuze, Derrida, and so on. And we're now picking up on the other equally important in many ways thinkers who perhaps don't have quite the same limelight as the others. And the intention behind this is not only to be able to share this platform and to extend the reach, as it were, of Digital Futures of the Doctoral Consortium all over the world, but also to form a repository of materials about these important thinkers that are available to everyone throughout the world for free. Today, I'm delighted to be able to introduce Vera Bühlmann, someone from TU Vienna, Technical University of Vienna, someone whom I met not a long time ago now, but a session on Deleuze in Zurich. Since then, she's now moved to take up an academic appointment in Vienna. Vera, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. And the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil, and the entire group, really, for this invitation. I think it's really precious and important to have this broad scope as well of the concentrated sessions on the thought of individual people. And I'm very happy to speak about Michel Serres today. I guess the main background is a book I published on Michel Serres 2 years ago now. And it was one of the first monographs. Michel Serres is, in a strange way, perhaps at once very well known, but also very rarely read or worked with. And what I want to kind of approach, or let's say the optics through which I would like to speak about Michel Serres, kind of tries to ponder why this might be so, and also how to approach this immense oeuvre, which contains some 70 books, I think, a lot of TV and radio shows, from somebody who dedicated most of his life to philosophy, but remains at heart really a mathematician in the way that he thinks, and also, that's perhaps even more strange for today's philosophers, very proud to say that he served in the military as a marine, so as a on the ships sailing the seas. And what I hope to show a little bit is how these things are really, there are chiastic crossings of all these different lines of constitution, perhaps we could say, that goes throughout every one of Michel Serres' books. And if one learns to kind of learn its motivic keys, it helps to see what the books do individually, because they don't really put forward an argument that would be positioned in an established field of discourse, where it would kind of demarcate and discuss its distinctions to others. There is a very strange kind of mood of writing that is almost like storytelling. It's very poetic, but it works with very, very few footnotes. This has always been something that for me was very attractive at one point, because it was promising that there is some sort of doing philosophy where one can learn to think without always already having to subscribe to one particular camp or one particular, let's say, field of discourse in a territorial kind of sense. And this remains, true, we can say, throughout the oeuvre of Michel Serres. I think it's also one of the reasons why scholarly attention has been has been rather scarce, let's say. So Michel Serres was studying in the same place and in the same time, like Deleuze, like Michel Foucault. His teachers were Gaston Bachelard and Jules Vuillemin. So really key figures in a history of ideas, which has become a very dominant paradigm meanwhile. And yet, in academic work, he is rarely, there is a rare silence, let's say, with respect to him. People more used to read him almost like as a private kind of pleasure, perhaps, or also for some sort of annoying. But there has been now, since his death in 2019, a vast project, a publication project started, which kind of revealed that Michel Serres actually did keep a very close, we could say, discursive path of how to relate and how to make public this kind of writing that he was doing. Michel Serres kept what he called cahiers de formation, so notebooks, meticulously and extremely carefully since his youth. So before he had even published the first book, he already started to compose these notebooks, which are now being published, all of them. I think last summer, the first volume came out. This is only an excerpt which kind of gives the character, also the graphic character of what his pages look like. But the first volume, which is one, I think, out of planned 20 volumes or something like that, each around 900 or 1,200 pages, which really give us the precise, if we want, self-observed journey that went on in the scholarly and in the academic kind of way of engaging. So Michel Serres did not, of course, not write in a vacuum or out of context. Of course, he was reading all these people whom we know from the established discourses around structuralism and post-structuralism and formalism and foundations in mathematics and so on. Of course, he was reading all these, but he decided not to publish in that way, not to write in that way about what he thought. And what I want to focus now, and it's a little bit of a trying out, I've never done it like this so far, but what I would like to choose as a kind of an optical lens for how I hope to bring Michel Serres a bit closer to the interest of those who haven't yet spent a lot of time with his writing, through thinking about this gesture of writing that is Serres. On the one hand, with this enormous, so for me, this cahiers de formation, when I looked at them, were very, very, let's say, even irritating, because they manifest such an enormous will to control his legacy and the interpretation of his books. That is rarely met. I've never encountered anything like that before. And this seems to contradict a lot the more anarchic, let's say, temperament that goes into writing in a literary, let's say, with a literary kind of reason. So not to take the territorial politics of academic formation too serious, but to kind of claim that it must be an adventure. Oneself sets out on a travel, on a quest that concerns the whole world and perhaps even death and so on, on which ultimately one maintains a kind of an intimate relation to one's thinking. One is not always playing a game of representations. So these notebooks really kind of form or appear to form a certain contradiction in this liberating temperament. So I'm thinking a lot about this, and I have some, let's say, hypotheses, perhaps, of how one can bring it together with the strengthening of a notion that is very dear to me for a long time. It started really when I spent a lot of time reading Deleuze together with Michel Foucault, and especially Michel Foucault's book on method. So I developed an interest on method specifically in relation to architectonics. And architectonics in this sense, and that's what Michel Serres can foreground again, much more than Deleuze or even Foucault do, is architectonics in a sense of natural philosophy. So architectonics in a sense that kind of unites or co-articulates, let's say, the soul, things that concern the soul, mathematics, and sciences of nature. Yeah. So it's clear that this approach does not postulate a distinction, a categorical distinction between things natural and things artificial, but the way of how to think of this categoricity, that is a bit at stake. And this categoricity has something to do with writing, mathematical thinking, and actually talking. So vernacular talks. For Serres, in his later books, this became very evident. He appears to be, to many it appears as if he is pretending or inviting to be very disrespectful to the sciences, because he starts to speak of scientific vernaculars. No, he really starts to embrace this kind of digital techniques, these tools, this machinery even, which is there, that frightens most of us. Actually, Serres was affirmative towards those, and not for simple reasons. So it's very complicated to get these reasons. And this notion of architectonics has something to do with it. So it's about thinking of Serres in terms of I'm not sure if this is now a good citation, but for the purpose of my point, it works well. It's by Max Scheler, a German anthropologist and philosopher, who was musing here about public knowledge. So it's called Bildungswissen. Bildungswissen is that kind of knowledge with which, for example, people like Gilles Deleuze are at war. No? So Bildungswissen is like establishment. So it is a kind of education which is genuinely public, and which brackets it, if one wants, one's own single and one's very intimate experiences that one makes. So the idea is not how can I generalize my most intimate ideas so that others will recognize them as valid, but the gesture is it's a gesture which, and now in a sense of physics, one must call conservative. So the reason why this should be important, Scheler put it quite humorously. He says, well, knowledge that has become Bildung, so formation, we could say, or edification as well, is knowledge which is no longer im Bauch klappert. No? So it's like when a mechanism is not, when there is no oil, no, and it makes clicks, it goes rough, it doesn't go smooth. A certain mechanics doesn't run smoothly. And he compares such a mechanics to digestion, and he says knowledge needs to be fully digested, and this digestion kind of makes it a material transformation of knowledge, which we cannot really get to the bottom of, or by looking for a cause for this transformation. So it's not analytics alone, it's an embodied understanding of education, which will be for the public good, because if people write and educate people with knowledge that doesn't run smoothly within this, let's say, huge stomach of history of ideas and approaches, things just get ugly and violent. So there's an ethical claim that comes with it. And it is something like this is how I tend now to understand this gesture with this control. It's a very disciplined, it's extremely disciplined. You see, even the way that the pages are filled, it's totally disciplined, it's fully controlled. To relate it to such a kind of an attention to formation and to knowledge. So I have 6 chapters, if we can make it. If we can make it through the first 3, it's already good. Perhaps it goes smoothly, and then we can make it through this understanding of history itself, architectonics and history. But I want to start with giving you something like Motivic keys. I call them ciphers, because a cipher is literally nothing in itself, but it establishes a certain alphabet in how we can make reference to things. Then I want to to think about, so it's one particular book that I want to take these motifs of thought from. It's Serres' first book, actually. It's his treatise on Leibniz, which was his PhD thesis. So he was very young when he wrote that. And from studying now closely and having read a lot of Michel Serres' writings, it is amazing how things are there in Nuce. So there is a notion of systematicity which one cannot elucidate by kind of, I mean, probably if one would read all these many, many, many thousand pages of the notebooks, one can also do it historically. But from the scarce sources of data and evidence of historical connections that are there outside of this cahier de formation, I don't think one could find this systematicity. The topics are so diverse. Michel Serres writes of a natural contract. He writes of a new notion of the human. He writes of the status of law today. He writes of the digital natives and what gives them pleasure with regard to education. He writes of geometry. He writes of religion. He writes of statues and architecture. He writes political treatises on the foundation of Rome. It's going everywhere, and yet there are the key motifs, at least I don't know if the key motifs, because I'm sure there are many more than the ones that I pick up, but there are key motifs already in this book on Leibniz which help to follow. And when I say key motifs, it's important to perhaps contrast it. This is a bit polemic now with the book cover. I'm not sure if George Agamben chose this or not, but it's a book on aesthetics with the intriguing title, The Signature of All Things on Method. So the interest here is very close, I would say, to Serres' interest in coding and in codification and in Leibniz, ultimately, in a treatise. But what is put forward here is this figure which holds the key, no? And the idea is that somehow one must become friends with this figure, such that she gives one the key, so one is given access to through doors which are already there, which are already closed. So there is somebody responsible if one doesn't get it. No? If one doesn't understand, if it's too difficult, and somebody holds a key for it. And nothing could be further from the way that Serres approaches this issue with the keys and with cryptography even. So in the Leibniz book, Serres says the notion of method that he wants to develop through Leibniz and this treatise, we should think of it as if we hold Penelope's thread, but the labyrinth is not there. So we know there is method. We hold the thread which will lead us out of the maze. We hold the thread, but neither is there a maze already articulated, nor is there some kind of objective monster like the Minotaur that needs to be contained, that needs to be put away. It's not like that. It's rather that he tends to think of the way that we have a relation to knowledge. Now, not only in this public sense of formative knowledge, but also in the intimate sense of articulating a world. And this articulation is an architectonic manner of articulation. So another aspect that makes Serres very difficult to relate to a lot of the contemporary or mid-20th century fields of discourse is that he never was interested in either going for or going against and something like a theory of a general linguistics. So what he instead wanted to develop is a general theory of invention, And of course, signs play a role and so on, but this notion of signs really is codified, it is encoded, it is encrypted, and it needs to be decoded and decrypted, and this mathematically. So mathematics comes to be like the forging art, let's say, the art of forging keys, but at the same time, as one is capable to forge keys mathematically, one also invents the spaces to which the keys would open doors, no? Or to which it would give us insight. So this is the notion of architectonics. Now, before I go more closely into this, I would like to offer a way of relating to the question of why would one do so? Why would one allow for so much vastness, let's say, that demands so much credit if one wants to link the different images, the different pictures, the different ideas that Serres got passionate about. And this comes from the very last book that Michel Serres published. He literally, it's a bit, I don't know. He sent it to his editor literally the night before he died. It has the title Relire le Relier. And it's a book on religion and on the double sense of religion, with reading anew, so the scriptures, but also religion as that which relates things. So Verbindungen stiften. Verbindungen, so, and stiften is important because it's engendered. So it's not how to relate singular points that are already there into a whole that emerges, but there's something of engendering in it. Engendering perhaps even creativity. And in this book, he speaks of, this one I want to show first, of method, and how method has to do with this. So with a relational thinking. And he says, this is now where his conservative stance, his physicist's conservative stance becomes graspable. He says, how can we, so method would be that which allows us to turn hatred into creative energy, aggressions into generosity, that would allow us to produce energy, how can we turn, it goes on, the listing goes on. So it helps us how to turn fires into energy for heating, tornadoes into wind in the sails on ships, and so on. No, so it's always how. So for Serres, and that's what is drawing him to Leibniz. There is a kind of a nature of evil, which still one is not passive towards. No, and that's the tricky thing, how to think this. And for him, it's method. It's a question of method. And this method basically links what he distinguishes as the domain of the meta, as we will see. So usually, or very often, people kind of muse about why this book, this famous book by Aristotle, was called Metaphysics. And we know the story that the meta means it follows just after the book of physics. But Serres' point of view here is that the problem is not with the meta, the problem is with the physics. So instead of having physics and metaphysics, there should be nomos, which is the theory of the laws, and metanomics. No? So the laws and the names, these two things go together. And like we have a relation between physics and metaphysics, there should be one between naming and the practice of naming. And the practice of naming is, in the old sense, what legal practices do. No? So this is where a notion of category is coming from. That has to do when we have a trial before court, when there was some kind of bad event and a person is accused, and it's about addressing this person in a just way. So how to do justice to a thing which is not in an already known way transparent. No, so we don't know. So a dark, a presence which is familiar but remains arcane at the same time. How to find adequacy in relation to that? So it's metaphysics and metanomics. This makes the two poles of what Serres will later in his book, The Natural Contract, put at the basis for an ecological thought. He says the way that we talk about things is crucial in how it contracts the way that nature itself speaks. No? So the idea there is that, it's a book that was published in 1990, quite some time before the general, let's say, sensitivization towards climate and the threatening outlooks that it poses. And it picked up that the earth is screaming. So many of the things we have now come familiar with through Anthropocene discourses and so on. Serres called attention to that, and he postulated we need something like a natural contract that will figure out how to address the earth with respect to how the earth itself speaks in a way that would be adequate. And to Serres, this was an issue of law, and it was an issue of philosophy. And that's why it's called a natural contract. I will not go into detail there, but this notion of a natural contract really only makes sense if one thinks of the relation of metaphysics to this metanomics as a kind of an analogy. So the whole notion of systematicity in Serres is a systematicity that will never escape the structure of analogies. No, things are always in analogy to one another. And this is actually what makes it architectonics, because an analogy is a double duplet. No? With an analogy, you have two ratios that are in proportion to one another. So you have four terms. You have A is to B, such like C is to D. No? Fire is to water, like earth is to air. You don't have a ratio for the proportion. You have a kind of a framework, the framework of an equation even, where there is an analogy as a structure. So this is the main thing one needs to grant when reading Serres' Leibniz book. Without this, it doesn't make sense. So then the question remains, no? If we have this meta, and if we have this kind of public formation, and then if we have this impossibility, so Serres did not believe that it's possible to have an entirely secular science. So this he shares, of course, with Agamben. But then how to speak, how to write, what to do. And one image that comes again and again through Serres is this kind of offer to say that one is living and writing as a Harlequin. I show you here a picture deliberately of a Harlequin from the period of Enlightenment, which was not at all fond of the Commedia dell'arte, and especially not of the Harlequin, because the Commedia dell'arte, where everything works through a relation of mimesis, that plays differently than trying to reproduce, no, or to take the place of the thing that one imitates. So it is a kind of a mimesis which doesn't play with representations. It's a sense of mimesis which engenders an embodied familiarity, being familiar, having connaissance. That's Serres' term, connaissance avec quelque chose. So to have a kind of knowledge that comes from mimesis, and which does not manifest in the right or the adequate representation, but in we could say, the sensitive body and the intuitive thinking. So the thinking which is alert and which is subtle, which can get the most generous, let's say, spectrum of particularities about things. So it's a generous thought. Enlightenment didn't like it. You see here, they wanted to say, well, even if one plays Harlequin, one remains a normal human being behind it. And if one tries to learn so much about mimicry and mimesis of whoever crosses one's path, this inscribes the deep suffering and the humiliation into the face of this poor guy behind the Harlequin clothes. So this is not how Serres relates to the Harlequin. This is not what he celebrates of it. And yet it is, in a strange way, a kind of realism. The way that he relates to the Harlequin has to do with a very famous story from, it's before Renaissance. I think it's from the 13th or even 14th century. Written by a woman. It's one of the very early texts which were authored by a woman, entitled The Emperor of the Moon. And The Emperor of the Moon was a text that kind of entered the scene of philosophy in quite outrageous ways, because the Emperor of the Loon would be the person in power in a place where there is no original brilliance at all. No, so the moon only reflects the sunlight. It doesn't emit on its own light. It just reflects. So then, when people were thinking, well, would it be possible to that there be life on a further planet? And it was, of course, the time when they started to have telescopes where they could actually see the surface of the moon and so on. So there was a great interest in these bodies, in these astronomical bodies, and their reality, their realism. And this piece, The Emperor of the Moon, was written at that time. It was a comedy dramatizing a kind of a public assembly where somebody succeeded in actually inviting this emperor of the moon, of this other world, to come talk about how life is there. And the plot is, of course, to say, well, life on the moon is just like it is here and everywhere else as well. No? So very sobering on the one hand. But what Serres does when he takes this as the motif, and it's actually here a citation from Leibniz, he says, well, yes, it's everywhere the same, but it's the same with respect to grandeur and perfection, to the categorical presence of largeness and perception. Because at the same time, then this is the second citation, which also includes the Italian theater, which is the Commedia dell'arte. It says, well, nature is beautiful exactly because it varies everywhere. No? And it's this kind of mimesis, if you want, between a variation within something that is universally the same, but the sameness has axes. So grandeur and perfection, they are not horizons, they're not planes, they are axes. So they open up a notion of scalarity and of scale, which since then really tries to help a notion of scale, which comes from weighting, so which is a mechanical notion, from collapsing into dimension and the representation of space. And this, to understand this, so a new way to think of scale, that's one of the things where the great actuality, I would say, of Serres' book lies. This is the avertissement, so it's the motto before he starts his book. The important thing is that the role that he will elaborate on architectonics is to say, okay, architectonics is like the inverse to orders of representation. So architectonics doesn't go with the point of view or with perspective, it goes with optics. It's very hard to imagine what this means. No? So it's a relation between the thing one sees and the way that the thing one sees is put into sight. No? Something like this. So there must always be a contracting by code between an object and the recognition as an object. So there is a primacy of phenomena. And these phenomena now, how can they be rationalized? This is what the book will be about. Serres' point is that, yes, they can be rationalized, but they can be rationalized in an abundant magnitude of multiplicities. So there is not one path. So the method articulates something amazing, no? So a labyrinth. And of course, there is an indefinite amount of how such an articulation of something labyrinthine can be done. So he gives another image for this. This is from the first chapter of the Leibniz book as well, where he says, well, actually, Leibniz, maybe we go here first. Actually, Leibniz never really wrote a book, he claims. No? This is strange because, of course, we have many texts by Leibniz. But he says he didn't really. So if one would reasonably assume that in order to make a book, one must have in one's head some kind of order, no, some kind of a distinction between a milieu and an end point and a starting point. In this sense, the Leibnizian philosophy does not manifest in a book. So he says, what Leibniz instead did in all his writing is opusculi. That's the term he uses. Opusculi is little works, and these little works, they start to populate a kind of a sky, like a zodiac, into constellations of reference points, which give us indexes of the space in which we are. No? So what Leibniz actually did when he constructed a system, and then his wording, no? So construire un système, c'est-à-dire un espace. So a system and a space, they are treated in the same way, but it's not that space needs to be, not that there would be a pure idea of space such that we can speak of a system. Rather, the system needs to dare believing method, no? So believe that one has Ariadne's thread, even if one has no idea where it should lead out of. Yeah, so it has an act of faith in the beginning, but otherwise the relation between system and space is, as we are, quite similar to as we are used to thinking. But that makes a big difference. Because he says, so when Leibniz was very young, he actually did write a full book, not just an opusculi, not just letters and small treatises, but a whole book, namely of the combinatorial art. And this small book, he says, il ouvrait toutes les promesses et toutes les prisons. So with this one book, this book did the opposite of containing dangers. This book unleashed every promise and all the prisons of the things that they would contain. So it's something very, very, on the one hand, promising, but very, very scary at the same time. So if we would think a book has something to do with an order, then Leibniz wrote almost a non-book or something like that with this. And Serres now steps in and says, no, but this is a misunderstanding. Rather, we should think of the relation between this book and the rest of this kind of constellations that we have from Leibniz. We should think of these things in the following way. He says, it is a little bit like when one throws several rocks into a pond, no, into the water of a pond, such that every one of these rocks creates circles that will cross each other, that will paint a drawing of crossing circles. But when the number of the rocks that one throws in one moment is too large, then les yeux s'y confondent. So then one's eyes, and this is now a super interesting term, confond, no? So it's lose themselves. No? So they kind of lose focus. So they lose focus, but through that they form a kind of a fond, le fond, so an ergründen or a formation, perhaps even a foundation. And the key sentence follows afterward. He says, it is a little bit as if one had to try to get lost in a liquid forest. And these now, they are, of course, they are beautiful metaphors, very strong and beautiful metaphors, but they're also natural philosophy. So there is a sense in which this gets too complicated, trying to disentangle. Let's have it work as a metaphor then. So a fluid forest. Leibniz later introduces a term. He says, so this liquid forest, he doesn't explicitly say we should think of it like that, but he begins to speak of shadows as a shore. So shadows as a kind of a beach. No? So light would be the sea, and shadows, they form the shore. So the relation between light and shadow is constitutive for the role that this optics plays. And Leibniz as well as Serres are very much interested in thinking of these relations in a sense that we could perhaps call something like a concrete metaphysics. So the forest, then the fluidity, then the seashore, they are all images that are and are not only metaphoric. But let's still think of what one might be doing, no? When one behaves like a Harlequin, engaging with these grand and grandest topics. Because it opens interesting ways of how to think of authorship. So this here is a citation that speaks of authorship in a manner that we no longer really do, but I think it's very illuminating to recall. So he says, there are 4 ways to write a book. She who writes other people's things without adding anything is a scribe. She who writes other people's things by adding things not his own is a compiler. She who writes other people's things as the main thing and adds his own things for clarification is called a commentator. One who writes others and his own things, but his own as main and adds others' things for confirmation is an author. Yeah. So there is this notion of authorship that Serres will pick up again and again and again, because the authorship does not come from writing a book. The authorship comes from saying, this is what I will sign with my name. Yeah? So it's a responsibility action that is very much at odds with the interest of relating to judgments through legitimization, so through objective reasons. Instead of objective reasons, for Serres, there is an objective transcendental. And this objective transcendental is not forged by a logical system, but is engendered and performed by the liberal arts, by knowledge as liberal arts. And liberal arts, they don't conflate the 2 distinctions. On the one hand, we always have for each one of them, there is a figure where legend says it's coming from. So the knowledge of this art is coming from. Here we have music, and we have the smith, no? The smith of which legend says he produced these sounds that Pythagoras heard, and then had the idea of the chord, no? That can be proportioned and then give basically the harmonic system. So the system of notation remains absent explicitly, but manifests are the legends and the instruments. And that's it. No? So this objective transcendental in writing, it would have to be absent, but deciphered out of all the objects that we start to look at. So this is where the crypticism is coming from. So the words cannot elucidate the things directly. Yeah, but the words, the things are present, but the words or the notations, they capture how there can be a storytelling that proceeds by mechanics and by instrumentality. So next to music, we have geometry, we have arithmetics, we have logics, we have dialectics, we have rhetorics, and we have, of course, astronomy. There is one last book. It's not a last book, but it's an almost last book where Serres relates to this approach to education, and it's his book on music, where he begins like that. He says, so before we can learn to think anything, our bodies need to pantomime, to mime everything, no? And to kind of build out repositories, residues of formalities of which we have no clue what they do and what they are. And then one muse joins another muse, and eventually one forms a body of thinking that behaves like the liberal arts do. And in that book, he also picks up this idea of the shore of the shadows. And this is when he speaks of something that is quite counterintuitive. He speaks of this term that he calls a music sum, no? And usually we would say music, so to sum up, music is kind of beyond the point, no? So music, so to sum up music would take all the character that makes music out of it. So it's very complicated to think. What he wrote is this. He said, "What do you hear beneath these languages of sciences? I will tell you exactly what the Sibylls have taught you, the stochastic noise of the world, and you don't know it yet. It's music sum. Like Aphrodite, mother of all beauty, born from the foam and surf, rises abruptly from the chaotic sea of turbulence, music." No? So there are several images coming together. One is that there is a notion of divination at work in Serres' non-linguistic relation to language. But the point is that vision and hearing, so optics and acoustics, they're like black and white, but they don't play in the same spectrum. We need hearing in order to open up a spectrum of sight, and we need sight, so seeing, in order to hold on to what music is. And the question, or this is how I understand what is the idea with this summing here, I relate it to a gesture of summation, which meant not like addition, no? So a kind of a mechanical operation that could, through iteration, gain positive values, but a summation like people in scholastic times were thinking of when they were trying to write the highest sentences. And these highest sentences, they would never be it, no? So they would never reach a peak that cannot be topped. But it's a gesture of trying to hold things together in a formulation or in a kind of a notation even that manifests such a vertical axis. A vertical axis which is not rooted in one identifiable point of origins. The beauty of this, perhaps, and time is going very fast, perhaps we can open the discussion already quite soon, and then depending on how there are questions, I can elaborate more on certain points. So why re-evoking these old things? No, what to do with them? And so Serres has a very uncomplicated relation to metaphysics, we could say. No, metaphysics is, let's say, where identity is at stake. But identity for Serres, and that's his ambition, is always, we need to think of it global. So of universality, but global. And that's, of course, the difficulty, precisely because it puts to the foreground, what does it mean to learn something? This here is, so Serres, he created all sorts of abstract persons. He calls them, well, des personnages, no? Like a pantope, for example. The place which resides all over the world is pantope or panchron. So with these figures, he establishes his metaphysics. He says it's a metaphysics of the pronouns, because his philosophy cannot be, philosophy itself, that is his strong conviction and his realism, really. Philosophy itself cannot be a philosophy of the pronouns. We cannot have a philosophy of the me and I and you and we and they. So a lot of, or yeah, probably one has to put it like that. No, this is where Serres' approach is very much at odds with German idealism. It's not a philosophy of pronouns, but it is a philosophy of prepositions. That's what he always said. So prepositions which index a space that is not yet articulately here. No? And these philosophy of prepositions, they also kind of form some kind of subject, no? of agent of thinking. But these agents, they are public persona, and yet they are invented. And he started to give them name. He said, okay, if we cannot make place or space, either one of them primary, well, we need to be able to think the summation of all places as space. But we cannot think this unless we create a person through which we can actually do it, think it. This becomes Pantop. He does the same for Panchro, no? For every counting of time, we need to, so the counting of time and time itself, we need to think a summation of them through a person that he invents, and this is Panchro. No? He has, I think, 6 or 8 such characters, and he says these characters, they give us the metaphysics of coding. And here is how he describes one of these characters, which he calls the third one, which is instructed. No? So the idea here is that it's a very old notion of dialectics, but it's a dialectics where there are always 3 poles involved. So one person can dialectically talk with another person if each of them have their own intimate discourses. In former time, people would have said, to God, no, some kind of prayers or something that transcends the public exchange of knowledge. And Serres kind of proposes to invert this relation and say, well, the third is what is actually being educated or instructed through dialogical exchanges. No? So when we talk to somebody else, we always need to have a larger picture in mind. And we are actually trying to codify a larger picture which we have in mind. So this is a key gesture which changes the relation between being a master and being a student. No? So the person, and he speaks of incarnation here actually. No? La personnage qui incarne l'éducation et l'apprentissage. Also there is this third instructed, it incarnates his theory of education and apprenticeship. And then this interviewer asks him, can you elaborate? How do you think of this third instructed? Is it a professor? And then Serres says, no, I don't think so. Is it a student? Also not quite. No? He says, well, he's one of my fundamental heroes because he incarnates the humanist of tomorrow. It would be somebody capable to make the synthesis between the literary education and the scientific education. So it is a passerby, no, a passeur, somebody who transcends or who traverses. And he says, this is more or less the image which I have been making myself. No, it's an avatar of Pantop. And Pantop is the one which has access everywhere. So if there is this figure of places which are so Pan means all, Top means a place, no, a figure that incorporates all of the places. It means they are not so they have access to everything. So this is an avatar of that. Yeah, and you see, so there is a whole way of treating of the biggest questions that we have in philosophy in quite a fabulating manner. But there is, at the same time, to this fabulating manner, I call this there's an objective rigor. So it's not arbitrary. So one doesn't need to believe the stories. One can, if one picks up the keys and goes and searches the sciences, for example, one sees how the storytelling has something to do with this commedia dell'arte. It's about not representing knowledge that should be common knowledge today, because if one would represent it, one makes oneself the professor, one makes oneself the person in authority. But to kind of instigate and to evoke, to incite, really, the disposition now, that the mental disposition in the person with whom one is in exchange to find it on their own. And in my experience with Serres, this has exactly been what happens. If you read his texts, you follow the very few footnotes that he has. So don't go and look up what some introductory books about Serres' role in structuralism or this or that kind of makes of it, but look actually up the sources which he names and try to form your own idea of what he talks about. It will be an idea of great general relevancy, which will work for you as a key to traverse a lot of these gatekeeping locks that kind of tell you, if you're not an expert here, you should rather not speak of information or entropy or the digital in its mathematical sense or whatever it is. No? So it's really quite an empowering philosopher on whom scholarship is just about to start. So there are books coming out now and journals and conferences. And what remains puzzling is this gesture of the cahier de formation, because this points to some kind of scholastic future. No? And that's a very different tone. So this, perhaps I open with this open question of what you also think. That's a very different tone than, let's say, the optimism through which he wrote in Sambellina, no? Where he celebrates the digital native as a generation with regard to taking care of the big problems. Yeah, thank you very much. I have a lot more. I can go into depth and details and bring things closer together as you like, but I think as a kind of a zodiac, it's enough for a start. Thank you.
Thank you, Vera. Thank you. That was wow, a lot to take in. Yes, let's start with some questions. We have both a Zoom audience here and also a YouTube audience. So that if those on the YouTube would like to write their questions in the chat, and we can open up to questions from the Zoom audience as well. But maybe I could just kick things off. I mean, I guess I was trying to locate the figure of the architect in this, and in some senses, there's a kind of metaphor almost of this person dealing with all these different subjects, a master of none, but somehow dealing with everything, which somehow, to my mind, always is the figure of the architect. We embrace everything in some senses, both the arts. We straddle the divide between the arts and the sciences, and so on and so on and so on. It's a without being a particular expert in any more particular thing. So I could sense the presence of the architect, and then this term architectonics or architectonic, which you bring in, which has been deployed within the architectural arena as well. And I was trying to locate any specific reference to architecture, and I'm not so sure whether or not Serres does that. But obviously, some of the associates did. Derrida wrote about this in some senses. Deleuze did, in a kind of metaphorical way, shall we say? And Foucault refers to the panopticon as a kind of as a diagram of how society works. So the architecture is definitely present in that in that particular moment in French philosophy. So I was wondering if you could tease out for an audience that is not totally but primarily from an architectural background, where you see the kind of purchase in the world of architecture and where the figure of the architect lurks in this incredible ensemble of ideas.
Yeah, okay, that's a great question, actually. So I think the way that this term architectonics comes back in Serres' work, it's almost like a time, eine Zeitreise, a travel through time to before Kant. No? So the term with Kant became a key term in how to build logical systems. He called this architectonics, and for Serres, it's almost the inverse of that. No? So it's not, so logics itself is never a system. The way one reasons in logics can be systematic, but then the systematicness cannot be objectively represented. So it's like, how do you, so then this systematics has something to do with, in German, we have this term, das Können. It's not really skill, no, it's an ableness, it's a skillfulness, but it goes on a scale of perfection or of qualification, which is infinitesimal. No, it's like an infinitesimal or a verticality or something like that. So, and it plays to, so it's how do you, if you have this for something, so if you're an architect, no, you embody it, you are Pan, you embody this kind of finesse and you're able to do all that. How possibly can you convey this to somebody else who doesn't? No? So I think this is the problem. And in my understanding, this is very much the problem that Vitruve had as well. It's a bit different in the Renaissance. It's different than with Alberti and with the treatises of the Renaissance, and very different with Enlightenment and modern architecture. But for Vitruve, I always thought this is exactly what he is doing. And it's a genuinely political gesture. Because it says, so now there is, with Vitruve, there is this emperor and he's going to build an empire. And nobody knows how to talk about buildings. So he will just decide and kind of make it. So let's set in place a language game, a way of talking, of making reference to what is not yet there, that will be public, that will be shared among professionals, that many can kind of temper and comment, and accept or augment or refute the political agendas that manifest architectonically. And it's very much in this sense that I perceive the role of architectonics in Serres. So it's perhaps today not evident why an architect would have to learn this political gesture. No, but that's why I'm trying to find ways of bringing in this level of the public, and also of a kind of a literacy, so where things are personal in a way that where the person is not one's intimate self, but the person is a public face. It's a public appearance. It has more to do with civility than with community and so on. So this domain, I feel, is this line of architectonics will help to address this today, and I think it's very timely. We need to do that, because the architecture of it, if we want, I mean, we are challenged by the algorithms now, in our systematical, logical thinking. We are very much challenged by a kind of a material sensing that comes through the digital now, together with the logical systematics, which tops us.
Maybe sorry.
No,
maybe just pick up on that, because there seems to be also the kind of domain of the digital lurking behind his thinking, since he was talking in a sense through codices and so on. And I was, I guess I see him within a tradition that was maybe more sympathetic towards technology than many of the things happening in the Anglo-Saxon culture, in the sense that philosophy was really part of a divide between the arts and the sciences, a very unproductive divide that C.P. Snow talks about. And yet somehow in the French tradition, we get this, from Bachelard around there, this kind of embracing of the history and philosophy of science, and many others, Latour and so on as well. And I guess Stiegler is also another figure that comes to mind, who began to engage with the domain of the digital. And I'm just wondering whether he in any way engages with that, or it remains a kind of background metaphor behind his work. Did you detect this? Because I know that you've been heavily involved in much of the computational thinking in the work that's going on in Zurich with Ludger and so on. Maybe as a kind of comment, we could unshare the screen so we could maybe see each other as well, rather than So yes, the figure of the digital is again lurking behind there. It seemed to me. Maybe you could just elucidate that a bit more about how you see the rest of his thinking to the digital.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely constitutive. So without the digital, it would let's say the gravity in these light-hearted words, So and only what is written in so the stories are pleasant to read. They are not they're not crushing you. So it's a very light, it's a very elegant, it's a very poetic style of writing of the biggest things. And this in itself is a gesture which is very hard to bear. And for me, the turning point, so I appreciated him for his poetic writing when I was studying literature for a long time, but he really started to become interesting when I started to, through the Hermes books, when I started to follow his indexes of how to address information and the digital. So this is constitutive. So the way that he speaks of coding is not linguistic because it refers to information as a physical quantity, no? And a physical quantity which has a particular mathematics. So there is so it's not a contradiction to say we speak in vernaculars through mathematics. So this is to a lot of scholars today totally unacceptable. No, in mathematics everything is exactly necessary because of the systematics, and otherwise it's not digested. It's not mathematics. This is different with Serres because Serres insists that no, we have a constellation between arithmetics, numbers, between geometry forms, between formulations and algebra, between harmonics and networks, constellations, and so on. There is not one order among them. When we think mathematically, we architect orders for this mathematical thinking, but they then are precisely this, they're architectures of thinking. So none of them per se is superior to the others or more useful to the others than the others. They will have to prove themselves in terms of what they're capable of accommodating. And that's where this ethical line comes in. No? So the question is not, is something computable or not? The question is, how do we develop a notion of modeling that will accommodate the most generous, but also the simplest? No? But these are always at both. So the simplest solution, which is the most generous solution. And this needs abstraction that is explicit, that is mathematical, and that needs to have a relaxed relation to being encoded. So it's always, if you want, dressed up. It's never pure. You never get it immediately. And this coding is arbitrary to a certain extent, but it does manifest objectively. So what he calls for is like when a lot of the digitalization hype, let's say, the people who hype it, they say, well, it's liberating people to democratize. No? So I mean, a lot of people feel uneasy now saying that because it obviously manifests so differently. But Serres' engagement with cybernetics and with digitization from the very beginning was going in the opposite direction. He says, no, now it becomes serious. Wow, finally thinking starts to matter again. And it matters not because one is in a position where one is given the power and the public and so on, not for social reasons, but for natural reasons, for scientific natural reasons. So it will matter where we put our attention. No? So the authorship is not about, it's not an individual, so kind of communicating what one thinks in terms of opinions. The authorship comes to reside on where do we place relevance? How do we distinguish between things more relevant than others? And how do we do this publicly? So there is this one book, Times of Crisis, which is also quite late, from 2014, I think. It was in response to the financial crisis, where Serres proposes, so first of all, he says, well, it's true that events kind of demarcate history, no, for things that discontinue, but from a geophysical point of view, everything manifests, so time manifests in crisis, no? And the crisis then is when something, when there is a judgment, so when it comes to a stop, and he says, the relevancy between the crisis has to do with how large is the period of continuity that comes to an end with what we call a crisis. So there are many crises, and he proposes in this book to read money and the financial transactions as giving us scales of assess crisis in this way. So he does become, this is architectonic thinking, no? That tries to build a building that can contain very, very generously things that are alive now, that happen, that come by, that challenge, that want to find a place, no, that fight for territory or for presence and so on. And this, so there is in Serres' writing always, it's like so where people get, no, when we say money is a general equivalent, and then so is code, no, between signs. So code is a bit among signs, like money is with respect to values. But Serres never tried to find a general theory of coding or a general theory of science. He always puts it into an analogy structure, into a proportion. So the coding and the information is then like a bit like metaphysics is to physics. That's how I always thought of it. No? So metaphysics wants to accommodate what is evident about nature through physics. And in a similar way, this thinking, this communication that he speaks about, this physical communication, no, he has this maxim, he says, we have a new universal scale today with the computer, with electricity. And it's that everything which exists, whether it's a star in the galaxy, whether it is a rock, whether it is a human being, whether it is, I don't know, some piece of food, it doesn't matter, anything at all engages in an at least five-fold activity, which is to receive, to send, to store, and to deal with information. And then information is depending on the relation among these things. So it's mathematical and physical. It can be flavor, it can be temperature, it can be color, it can be energy, it can be whatever. So it's a natural philosophy for the information age. That's, I think, the shortest and the most apt way to frame what Serres does.
That's helpful. Just one particular point before we move on. We got several questions lined up in the chat. Does Serres at any point refer specifically to any one architect? We look through the history of philosophy. There are a number of references. Obviously, Wittgenstein actually was working on a building. Derrida refers to Bernard Tschumi. Deleuze refers to, I think, Bernard Cash as one of his students. Adorno refers to Adolf Loos and Sharon and so on. Does Serres at any point refer to any architect in his quite considerable oeuvre of work?
Well, he does to Vitruve and to mnemonics. So this link is quite intimate, and then in antiquity as well. But in modern architecture, I'm not aware of. I don't think so.
Okay, yeah. The figure of Vitruvius actually came to my mind as you were talking, as this kind of your discussion of the pan of the everything, which is behind this seemingly impossible challenge to the architect that Vitruvius talk about being an expert of all these different areas, which is clearly impossible. We've got a series of questions in the chat. We first of all,
can I very quickly, one thing perhaps with your question for the architect. I mean, Xenakis was kind of an architect with composition in music, no, at this border. And Xenakis,
he was an architect, right?
The musician, yes.
Yeah, he was an architect by training, Xenakis.
Even this? Okay,
yes,
well, he was a composer. So. I know him as a composer.
He worked for, I might have got this wrong. I thought he worked for Le Corbusier on that pavilion.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, exactly. And
where was it?
But he did a PhD in composition in music, and Michel Serres was in the committee of this PhD. And there is a very beautiful book entitled Alloys, where the 5 reviewers of Xenakis' presentation and composition thesis get feedback. And Serres is, this is perhaps as close as it gets to how to relate his notion of elements and information magnitudes and so on to really a constructive and a composing practice.
There should be some study on that, because I think that would be extraordinarily interesting to. I mean, Xenakis is a very intriguing figure in the first place. Anyway, let me keep quiet and hand on to my colleagues here. We've got Gustavo first of all, then Cletus, and then Marcelo. Gustavo, would you like to maybe ask your question?
Sure. Hey, good morning. Thank you, Professor Bühlmann, for all your, I guess, very dense, but also accessible view. I guess my question, I think we were leading to my question, but I'll just ask it the way I wrote it. How does Michel Serres think through the concepts of cybernetics, information, and complex systems to get to the digital age, so our contemporary notion of the digital? And it seems like you alluded a little bit to the idea of mathematics or stochastics, or if he was a part of Xenakis's committee or trajectory, then I can see how Xenakis unfolded some of his theory into architecture. But I am a little unclear about how he would perceive the idea of cybernetics and complexity as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Yes, gladly. It was to a large part the focus of my book, which is entitled, it's exactly looking at that. So it's Mathematics and Information in the Philosophy of Michel Serres. And a lot depends on with information science. So through whom do we study it? It's not like there is one common canon of how to understand the relation, even what a channel is, or between negentropy and entropy. So these notions are now they become astronomical, no, with Rovelli and his work. So it really becomes physics again. And that's, to my awareness, for almost everyone except Michel Serres, that might come as a surprise. But for him, it was what he always was trying to delve into, so through physics. And the key references, there are two key references. It's a long time now. It's information. Yeah, I can't recall. So there are.
Is it information theory by Claude Shannon? Is that what you mean?
Of course, he refers to this as well.
Yeah,
But it's like the electroengineering application of the thinking.
Yeah.
So then this is the theory describes the fabrication of these objects, no? But physically, the question of what a channel is not closed with that. So there it's the dispute around, then that goes to biology, that goes to genetics as well.
Yeah.
So one of the books that is hugely influential for Serres was Jacques Monod's Chance and Necessity.
Okay, yeah.
And with Chance and Necessity, it's there is a first chapter about how to, which I think is so instructive for the question of an artifact or a natural object. It's called Strange Objects, and it describes how we cannot so and it doesn't matter which one, but any analytical algorithm will be inadequate to describe things not as a distinction on some scale, not that you find. And this emphasis on the notion of scale, that it will always be both rational and artificial. So this is a key for Serres' entry to information theory. So it's but it's the more important one is this guy who picked up. There was one person starting to speak about the price of information. So to say, in terms of information theory really casts it's not, we cannot reduce it to thermodynamic entropy, because if information has to do with the converging of energy into another form of energy, then there is this converging goes across a kind of he calls it niveaus of abstraction, no? On which scale? So with the small energies and the large energies. And for almost all of them, the conversion is almost gratuitous. But then when it comes to very small scales, there is a price to pay for this conversion. And thermodynamics cannot address this. And this was the price of wait, maybe I find like this, the reference. This was, I think, a Polish scientist with a paper that did not gain a lot of attraction until this French larger scientist picked it up. Brillouin. This was it. Louis or Léon Brillouin. He is the main referent. Brillouin. A theory of information, I think. Léon Brillouin. In science, is this it? Yeah.
Oh, can you put the reference in the chat, please? So
Yeah.
I think all of our group can move forward. Just one a question also. It seems as though that he was prolific in kind of his thought process and production. How did he think about the work of Einstein to kind of this going from one domain of mathematics to another, to the quantum realm, and this idea of the theory of everything? Because at some level, information is a way that we can encapsulate a theory of everything, because at least that's what the quantum physicists are thinking through. Information can define totality, but what was Serres' understanding of that and his frameworks of understanding the world through his perspective?
His commitment was to a universalism, yes, but there cannot be one theory for it. So this for him is I think, it's very far from what he is looking for. No? Because the theory of everything would precisely negate this strange economy with the price of information, which makes philosophy, or let's say the pursuit of thoughts to realize themselves, also an ethical thing. So there is a gravity to these things, and that's what commits him to a natural philosophy. So a natural philosophy would say, no, the ultimate questions cannot totally be elucidated. We need to build in modeling upon an obscure ground. And this in the end is, I think, why for Serres, Leibniz was our contemporary. No? So literally he called him that. He said Leibniz was trying to see in the mathematics of his time, which was the introduction of topology and structure, a notion of structure, what actually became reality in the mathematics of today, where we have further abstractions to operate upon fields and structures and so on. So he would not be a friend of a theory of everything, I don't think.
Yeah, I think in one last question, I don't want to take more of your time, but you talked, I know that in the sciences there is a domain where the mathematics cannot define reality. So in complexity theory, there is that's why they're looking at computational modeling to get to more of a certain type of reality. And I think Neil has spoken in past lectures about swarms and the idea of this logic building into a possible mimicry of life forms. But how did Serres look at that in between kind of this digital or algorithmic understanding of contemporary world versus the mathematical super abstraction of what reality is based on? So our world today is based on this mathematical, theoretical framework, but computation, and now with our sensors and everything else, we're seeing the nuances. How would he think through that type of, I think, evolution in humanity, or us as a species having a really precise tool?
Yeah, he wouldn't. So the way that he would turn it is more to actually visions. So he would say he wouldn't say we live on the basis of mathematical precision. He would say we live within the visions of people who have been thinking mathematically. No, and then these visions they open up as a domain, let's say, where time really almost doesn't pass. So not in a linear historical sense. It's not like the original version would be here and then it kind of degenerates and evolves like that. But it's more like with the planet Earth in a geophysical sense. So it manifests cuts through time that themselves are preserved in a certain way. So this has to do with what he calls the objective transcendental. So it's like traces from many different times, but trying to find a linear progression would be totally besides the point. No, so so he has one text where he calls it les anamnèses mathématiques. So anamnesis, he pluralizes anamnesis, no? Where the idea is that in mathematics we remember what we have forgotten when we acquire the body, basically. No? And he pluralizes this and tries to find, actually through structuralism, but a very specific notion of structuralism. He tries to find a way to refer or to speak about that domain. And this again doesn't, so one very strong thing that this is, in my understanding, is what the quantum physics, how it is transcribed in Serres' philosophical thinking. He says we need to arrange and to integrate the notion of forgetting just as much of memory. No? And this forgetting manifests physically. So it has something to do with this digestion. So this a multiplied domain of visions that remain contemporary and contingent upon one another needs to it involves the body. So it's only through the body that one can think this. So neither an inductive empirical kind of mimicry calibration of models with observed reality would be very mind-blowing as an ambition for Serres, nor a deductive system which claims follow us. That's it now.
Yeah, I'm curious about, and I think I just wanted to thank you. I'm just gonna end what I'm thinking. I would love to talk with you more, but I would really just wonder how, with the advent of AI and seems like our progression to make this simulated, whatever this new being is, how he would think through that too. But I just wanted to thank you very much for the wonderful time. And I'm actually going to go back and relook at some of the references that you spoke about today, because I think I was narrowly given a certain lens of his work. So it completely expanded what I should think about. So thank you very much, Professor.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Gustavo. So we have questions from Cletus, followed by Marcelo, followed by Michal. Cletus, welcome.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this talk. I just, very, very inspiring. And I find it just strikingly relevant to this forum and to the question of how do we proceed? How do we follow this Ariadne's thread, which, as you mentioned, takes faith? I was very much struck by something you said at the beginning of the talk. Why would someone allow for so much vastness? I think that just really brings us into focus of this time that we're in right now, where we are aware that there's so much knowledge that we also can't necessarily relate. And I think that that emphasis that you place on relationality, proportionality, that's what I got out of your mention of prepositions, because prepositions put things in relationship to each other as opposed to establish their identity. And I wanted to take that and ask you more about the very thing that we're kind of engaged in, is how relating to a model of education or interaction where it's no longer, as you mentioned, the master student, because I definitely sense that we're now in a space where no student who has access to the internet can presume that any teacher is the master of a closed field, right? One Google search arrives at some piece of information that, a teacher doesn't know. And so I think what you're pointing to is some other kind of a model. And I found the emphasis on musicality, possibly very productive in the sense that in the interaction between any two musicians, musician and student, there's an embodied proportionality that's part of the music that isn't exactly the same as knowledge. And so, this question of what do you do with an unbounded space? You mentioned a book as something that has an end and not being the object that either Serres or Leibniz was referring to. And I couldn't help but relate that also to John Cage saying, well, if I wanted to make an object, it would have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but I'm not interested in making an object. And John Cage seems very much to me one of those people who pointed to the vastness that in some ways is very unnerving to, you know, those of us who also think about objects.
Yeah, that's a nice, perhaps, and I mean, I'm happy you like these formulations. They're quite mystic. No, that's true. But Serres, that perhaps helps. Serres did not want to be a mystic. No, he said he's a mathematician, but he does philosophy. And the way he does philosophy is something like mystics of mathematics. No, the other way around, mathematics of mystics. So he doesn't try, so there as well, it's not the identification with the vision that he seeks, no, but the finding of pictures and images and formulations that then will be poetic like these. But the reference to Cage is very interesting, because one of the things I'm trying to, with this musicality, I think there is a way to speak silently, no? In a way, so imagine Cage would not, I mean, it's a certain arrogance to say, I'm not interested in making objects. No? It's a kind of an exclusivity to take oneself out of keeping ties with a kind of a common play science. And Serres always had, and I mean, it's very tempting, no, to follow this view. But Serres had in the early book, in A Parasite, this scene about the quasi-object, where he says, the good player cannot convey to the bad player directly how well he can play, but the worst is to take the ball and go look for another field to play. No, so, but to keep coding it, to keep packaging it in storytelling in a way of keeping on the conversation that eventually can be conveyed, the beauty that one devotes one's ambition to, let's say. And this, I find it a very interesting kind of gesture, as almost a form of, again, Harlequin. It's about pantomime, it's about mimicry, but it's not about identification with the object. And I do think that that's at least how I teach now in many of my courses. The young students, they should learn the gestures of the people they find important. So I almost forbid them to write academically formulated arguments, no, which would be following all these formalistic patterns that are now just produced by ChatGPT with a total ease. So it used to be difficult to write an abstract of a book, and then we tried to give indexes of what makes a good abstract and not a bad one, and it needs a level of generalism. It should not be too personal. If there is an opinion, the opinion needs to be framed, and all of these protocols. That's really what the AI now does much better. No, so there is no point in teaching the students to learn that now. So they should learn it by mimesis, by observing the AIs, and then try to mimic the gestures of thinking in people whose work touches them. No, so there is a kind of a common sense, a domain of common sense in which artificial and natural intelligence are mixed. But the idea is to find again people like Cage, no? So people that can give orientation, where one likes to follow because it becomes vast, because it becomes generous, because things are not so. It's not only flag words and positioning. So and there is with the digital. So with this new reality of computation, there is an enormous. It's not just the quickness, it's super fast, but because of that, one can afford slowness as well. So not to write 10 pages, but to rewrite a paragraph of only 200 words 10 times. No, it goes towards a kind of a skill in craftsmanship, of making sentences, of learning phrases, of keeping notebooks. I mean, before I saw this gesture of Serres with the cahier de formation, tell all of my students, you need to keep a notebook. You need to keep a treasure box of things that you find remarkable. It doesn't matter whether you cite authorities or whether it's from a pop song or whatever, but you need to have words. You cannot trust that all the words that will be important for you to use can be your own words. You need to like the rhetorical treatise would always educate people. And I think this comes back. So there is a new sense of care because the formerly difficult things become so easy. And I think that is actually, I mean, I wonder, but I would like to think that this is very much in the spirit in this of the early chaos and complexity theories, which were not obsessed with legitimization of knowledge versus non-knowledge. They were fascinated by the scalarity, the depth of things, by the by this kind of it's almost like a new realism of imagination that then can be speculated and one can see whether it's tuned well. No? So I think that's the term with musicality. Instead of can something be falsified, the question should be how is it tuned with? Or how does it tune with? So how much friction does it produce? How much do we have to sacrifice of something in order to make it compatible with something else? So it's a question of tuning, of climate, acclimatization, of Stimmung again as well, so of tempering. And these things, they are, so the studio in Zurich, where I'm still a lot involved with at DTH, Digital Architectonics, now they work with vast amounts of data, images, books, songs, movies, stills, and they entirely search with moods, with Stimmungen, with in a probabilistic domain, but so what they learn is how to control what they find in a probabilistic domain. Or also then this entails to say what one would hope to find in order to be surprised. So it's an interesting, there is a kind of a physicality to the domain of thought that becomes dialogically. So the interfaces as well are dialogical. No, it's no longer database. We don't ask where is a piece of knowledge lodging. It's dialogical. We need to carry on conversations. Yeah, that was a long answer. Sorry.
I very much like that answer. And if I can just add one thing or emphasize one thing that you mentioned that strikes a note with something that I've been wondering about. The mention you make of gesture and of sharing a gesture,
yeah.
Collecting gestures, seems a much better word in my mind. I've been wondering, what is it that we can share that is the increment of important meaning?
Mm-hmm.
And meme doesn't seem to be the right word, but and knowledge or facts don't seem to be the thing. But it seems to me that it has to be something better than just a like or a thumbs up or a thumbs down. That doesn't seem to create the textile fiber.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be something meaningful that can be shared and linked. And I would just say that this, your use of the word gesture and collecting and sharing gestures seems to hit that in a way that makes a lot of sense in terms of what we might share that can be knowledge or be productive, but has a kind of a quality that can be finely tuned or time. So thank you.
Thank you.
So we have excuse me, Marcelo, would you like to ask your question, followed by Michel?
Sure. Thank you so much for the presentation. I discovered Serres just recently, a few months ago, and looking into wanted to learn about chaos and chance. And in his book, The Birth of Physics, he elaborates on Lucretius' notion of the clinamen or clinamen. And I was wondering if you're familiar with this term and have any reflection on that.
Yes, yes, of course, nice. So the Kleiner is the minimal angle, in declination, and this I think is so. This should be taken very seriously as a guide. So of course one can say it's a differential, but it matters that it's an angle. So it's broken out of a circle, because with the circle we are in a domain that is more with arithmetics and with harmonics than with geometry, no. And to say the minimal, so there is but there, with the angle there still is a reference to the geometry, but it's through mechanics. So that with the angles we build mechanical instruments. So there is a mechanicalness that goes through the birth of physics, and it's an aspect which I have still almost never encountered in the reception of their specific treatment of it. It's that he says this birth of, so first of all, the birth of physics. Now, physics alone would be the abstraction, but it acquires a body. It gets real. It realizes itself. It is born. The birth of physics happens through the text of Lucrece, through the poem. Through the poem, physics can be born. So this is I would read this very allegorical. So through the poem, physics can be born, and it's not nature then in distinction to the artificial treatment of it. It's more like nature after a certain transformation, not after a crisis. So nature that has recovered from a sickness and continues to live, it will not be the same like before, but it will still be nature and healthy. But different. And this level has the poetics. And then how would the poetics be doing that? It's by accommodating and by, if you want, nurturing or nourishing the energies that go into the mechanics. So the mechanics itself is not a determining thing. So there is chance in it everywhere, no? Because there is cipheredness, as Serres develops it then later in the book Birth of Physics, but it's a mechanics of code which can become real through the poetic text as nature, as physics, and that all depends on having the circular, so the minimal angle, because with angles and with areas you are in a conservation cycle. You're not in a representation cycle. Through mechanics. So you conserve forces and energies, and you scale the processes. And that's why Archimedes is the hero of the hydraulics. That gives him the link to say, Lucrece actually wrote a chaos theory 2000 years ago, no? That we are re-detecting today. That is the outrageous thesis that Serres says. No, he says a chaos theory is a new thing, of course, but it's also a very old thing, and we can already find it in this text by Lucrece, where then chance is playing a role that is not epistemological but natural philosophical. So I would shy away. Most of the readings of this book try to read it as a differential in the sense of a philosophy of calculus. And one can do that, but then one will always miss, why is the cipher important? Why is Archimedes important? Why are the names of numbering? No, there is this passage. How do mathematicians actually acquire scales with regard to numbers? Also with Archimedes and the sand reckoner. How can we count the uncountable amount of numbers? How can we make it countable? And he says it goes by name giving. And this name giving introduces a kind of a branching and a genealogy that is of a poetic kind, so of a poetic engendering kind, not of a systematic analytical kind. Somehow, I don't recall in detail, but these things are missed if you just read the Klineman as a differential. But of course, you can read the differential through Serres' Leibniz book, and then the differential will create areas which will index mechanisms of minimal angles and so on. And there would actually be a beautiful loop there to uncover.
Thank you so much.
So, Michael, do you want to ask your question? If any other questions on the YouTube channel, put them in the chat. Yeah, Michael.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Neil. Thank you so much, Vera, for this wonderful presentation. Quite dense and a lot to go through. Also, really great discussion so far. Really enjoyed it. On a quick side note, I put in the chat here. I just wanted to point to this really wonderful issue of Technophony that you edited with Katarina Kolosova right now, Techne and Feminism. This is a really great and this sort of brand new. So anyone interested, please have a look into this on a side note. Okay, so I'm the question is maybe a little broad, and the reason for that is probably because I'm not very familiar with Serres. I'm actually just getting into the work in a little bit more depth. But I was wondering about this notion of the of the global that I keep in a way that keeps coming up in a way. There is this sort of notion of global intuition, or I think you also brought the global in certain ways, or like a universalism in a sense. I was wondering what the status of the global is in Serres' thinking, also in terms of, in a sense, obviously what many of us, I think, are trying to think about the global and the planetary, let's say, but also how can we reconcile that with the local, or notions of locality, and obviously without defending that against nationalism and conservative interpretations of that. So I was wondering about that, and also maybe that would also mean, I don't want to make this too broad, I think, but maybe also in ways that sort of the global has connections to, maybe we could say, modernity, and how, like, for instance, anthropology has been trying to think beyond that in terms of rethinking nature from a more sort of, let's say, local or particular perspective. I'll leave it there. It's a bit of a broad question, but thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for asking it. I think it's actually great. It's also one of the most difficult notions for me to kind of become friends with in Serres, because the global indeed is very important. I'm more drawn to the poetics and then the abstractions and so on. But there is actually, so that they in a way allow for a kind of decadence that will make the global more like so one aspect of the Harlequin is that everything he has ever seen inscribes in his code. So the Harlequin has no nakedness. There is no purity. And the figure for a global, something like a global citizen or something like that, if it would exist, would be a person in the sense of such a bit like a Harlequin, if it's global. So Serres is very much urging for a thought that, in one point he says, no, architecture should. So what is proper and what is home and what is origin? So these are to him aspects, let's say, of a philosophy of history that he so that's his labyrinth, no, where he tries to get out of. But he needs to understand what the Minotaur is in history, and that's how a lot of his inventiveness and his fabulation is nourished by, I think. So he would go as far as to say, no, everyone is a migrant. So it's in terms of when our world is now basically dependent on our actions upon it, with the Anthropocene, then nobody of us can expect to be at home in it. And also this notion of the crisis that I mentioned before, times of crisis. So he says a crisis has, on the one hand, it has this kind at the end of the day, so a judgment character, but on the other hand, it has its application in medicine, where a sickness is called crisis. And what he urges for is an understanding, then, a relation to history and also to progress, which would think more in terms of getting ill and becoming healthy again. So there is not a return to a prior time. And the globality would basically probably amount to something like dissociating, let's say, the domain of the general or the generally valid, not the universal, but the generally valid from ontology. It's not a classification of being that underlies it. It's something like an anamnesis of the sicknesses, no? And how, in what kind of images that they manifest, how we can keep a health record, let's say, something like that. The generality, not the domain of the general. So to dissociate it from ontology, I think that's the main difference to projects of a theory, a general theory for everything. They want to make ontology. So Serres wants to let it be. So right now we cannot attend to logos, to being through a formalist understanding of logos. But we need to hold on of the formally, and there's a very interesting discussion in the Leibniz book whether what he proposes then is Leibniz's systematicity, whether this is not simply a way of being formalist. And then he says, well, if formalism means one is lucid with regard to the laws, but blind with regard to the objects, no? So the aesthetics falls out, then to a certain extent, this is formalism, but the aim of this formalism is not an ontology or a classification system, but the forging of optics. So the forging of taking things into sight, according to this, as if in a liquid forest, no? Or as if throwing many rocks into the pond, which all cross circles, and we don't have an origin, and in the end it will just be entropy. No, so yeah. And how to hold on to this. So the general then is political. Primarily, it's a dimension that Serres rarely addresses explicitly. And it's different from abstraction. Abstraction would go with the interiorization of this mathematical thinking where one needs to build oneself. It has something to do with this public education, abstraction, but this public education needs to make world, no? But in a way where one cannot claim to be at home or have a proper origin, even that. It's more like in this anamnesis of a joint body. The biogea, so there would be the link then in Serres to biogea. Is this very loud? My dog is scratching. Can you hear that? No? Okay.
All good. I didn't hear it, but thank you, Vera, so much for these very elaborate answers. That's wonderful. I really like the sort of medical interpretation or lens that you brought up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michel. We have 2 more questions in the chat. Have you got time for those, Vera? Yiguo, would you like to ask your question, and then followed by Vasco?
Okay, actually, so first, I am grateful and appreciate Professor Vera's lectures to inspire me in a new way. So, but however, it's very hard for me understanding refer the measures notions to my work, like architecture compositions research in reality space in our age, like 21st century architecture environment. So I wanted to know how can you refer the Serres concept of interconnected system and the hierarchic organization to improve more like a lucid space layout and sections plans and the relationship between the social and the space. Yeah, like that. Yeah.
Yeah. The way I will answer is perhaps by picking up the previous question a little bit with the globality. No, because so if you speak of a concept of interconnected systems, then the way that through Serres one would think of that is more like how there are different languages that can be translated into each other, but there is not one original language with regards to which the translations would be clear. So there is not really, I mean, if there is such a thing like interconnected systems, it's not a determined So there are thousands of protocols. So then the question is, how can we call it a system? Yeah. So the way that how this could how this thinking of coding could inspire more fluid spatial layouts and relationships, I think is through it cannot be done unless one kind of grows up and opens up to the abstractions that are encapsulated. No, and then the fluid layouts wouldn't necessarily be like parametric morphings and everything gets round and continuous transformations. It would be more something like Junya Ishigami with a new scale of architecture, the scale of forest for architecture, or the scale of the horizon for architecture. So these are ideas of space which involve a lot more abstraction in order to become transcribed or translated into an architectonic articulation. But they are also triggered and possible by, if we want, because in terms of ecology, all these different spheres, they do communicate with one another. So I would answer in this way. So there is no way to compute this automatically or to make a new software which will find a new aesthetics that can suggest such a kind of a fluidity. This is this wouldn't work, I think.
Okay. Okay. So yeah. Okay. Thank you. Maybe I will thinking more deeply later and read more books.
Thanks, Yi. So I have a question from Vasco, and he tells me that there's background noise, so I'm going to read it out. For you, it's in the chat, though, Vera, if you want to check it. Serres' exploration of time, memory, and history prompts us to reconsider the temporal dimensions of architecture. How can architects engage with Serres' concepts to create spaces that resonate with cultural memory, heritage, and future aspirations?
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, so no, with all of, obviously, first of all, I'm not a Serres expert, so I have a very, let's say, biased way to navigate through Serres, and there is not an established scholarship on it. So what you got is my passions for it. So there would be other books, I could have discussed other books, and the overall picture and mood would be very different. So the way that I would answer to this question with the resonance is in a similar way biased. So this idea of tuning or of a harmonics, which is quantitative, no? So not a harmony, not the idea that there are melodies which are harmonical and that's what we should find as an image of beauty and health and so on, but a harmonics, which is of a certain materialism. It's a certain physics. It's a certain medicine perhaps, no, or something like that. Then the tuning, or how can there be a different notion of time? It should be possible, and I think Serres does it, to look how Serres really writes is trying to invent how to describe how somebody writes who writes in many tongues. No? So normally we would say if somebody speaks with a split tongue, he's not telling the truth. No, so he's not. There's no authenticity. But Serres is so deeply in language. He is always. And I'm very convinced of that. He's trying to find out how to create an appearance of abstract mathematical ideas in a common and a more popular and a domain of wider reception, like a playground. So what do they need to wear? How do they need to behave? What should they be in terms of their ambitions and their friendships and so on, these concepts. So concepts are dressed up everywhere. And then there is a way that's similar, perhaps, how we could think of the appearance of a house. So there must be a way how such an appearance can speak through many voices at the same time. No, so to have something so quite contemporary, quite pragmatical, quite utilitarian even, but then also layers of things which would not absolutely be necessary with regards to something, but they're placed in such a way as to open up a kind of a resonance depth of time. Also, perhaps even with projects of building conservation. No? So there it's very interesting that I think almost nobody would say, an original state would have to be preserved or a new state would have to be realized. But it's like a dancing across a chronological cuts with conservation. So one kind of assesses a building in its layers, in its temporal cuts, and then one needs to figure out what to do with these cuts through time that are chronological. So they're countable. It's not the qualitative time of the memory and the deep feelings and so on. It's quite explicit, but it's many of them. So how to relate to that? And there must be ways to do that in a manner where you kind of augment the tunings of certain things and the decrease of other things in a sense that would have a lot to do with this notion of authorship that says, here I sign. No, this is as good as I'm able to do it. Not, here is my idea, please follow it. No, but it's like the commission as an architect to create a public space in a certain way. Here I sign, this is as good as I'm capable of doing it. And you're not there's not it's not a scientific reason why this is the best. So it would really strengthen also the understanding of architects. No? If it wouldn't have this strange split between either science on one hand, engineering, technology, optimization, economy, and then the artistic gesture, which must be incomparable to anything else. No? This is quite a schizophrenic setup that we have today.
Thank you, Vera. Thank you. We're just over the 2 hours. I think we're in a situation where we can begin to wrap up. This has been a lot to think about, a lot of food for thought, and really a remarkable series of ideas out there. So much to think about. And this brings us to the end of what has been an amazing series. I think a huge contribution. I mean, we've been dealing with perhaps the less well-known or still very significant thinkers, and it's really, I think, just brought out how much more there is to be excavated in terms of these ideas and thoughts and how they can be deployed within an architectural arena to enrich our thinking. So, Vera, this has been a wonderful demonstration of how we can tease out so much more, and there's not yet more to be done. We will continue next year with another series of architecture and philosophy, trying to build upon these layers, as it were. And we also have a session coming up in the fall, which will be devoted more to, let's say, to the area of AI and thinking of cybernetics and neuroscience and so on. There's a lot that's happening there too. So I just wanted to thank everyone who's been involved in this incredible enterprise. I mean, it really. If it seems fairly effortless, it's not because it's effortless, because a lot of work goes in to sorting this out. And so I want to thank, in addition to our incredible speakers, especially Vera today, the team that lies behind it. Michal Just has been the real backbone behind everything, putting together the posters and things and helping sort those out, but also the rest of the team who've been promoting it on Digital Futures. It's an astonishing, I think, a sign of our passion for ideas, for architecture, that people are contributing their time in this way for the benefit of everyone else. And I think this is the most important thing. We need to have a global platform. There's no one school, one professor who knows all these things. It's only by joining forces, by sharing our information, sharing our passion, sharing ideas, that really we're going to move forward. And I think this is where the Digital Futures platform has been very successful. And I hope that everyone will enjoy the YouTube library of ideas that we put forward. So if you go to digital.futures.international, you will get a link to the YouTube channel itself. Thank you so much, Vera. And let's continue the discussion. And please come and join us, Vera, for our discussions next year. We now have started with Slavoj Žižek. We've been all the way through and had an amazing series. So it's all out there for everyone. And thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all. I look forward to continue exchange. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you
Thank you,
also to
everyone.
Andre Radman, who's been helping from TU Delft. I think the more we can bring together many different institutions and things as a basis for this, the better for the future. So thank you. Thanks.